Billionaire Ethan Cade had everything, except something real. When he offered struggling waitress Maggie Hayes $10,000 for one honest dinner, he never expected her to change his life. But as secrets unravel and enemies close in, will their love survive the cost? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The glittering skyline of New York City reflected in the spotless windows of Cade Enterprises. On the top floor, Ethan Cade stood with his back to his office door, staring out at the empire he'd built. At 36, he had everything money could buy: a penthouse apartment, luxury cars, designer suits, and a net worth that put him on every important list in the country. "Mr. Cade?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "The board. Members are waiting in the conference room for your birthday celebration." Ethan sighed. Another year, another fake celebration with people who only cared about his money and influence. "I'll be right there," he replied, straightening his tie. The conference room erupted in applause as he entered. Charles Wilson, his right-hand man, approached with a glass of champagne. "Happy birthday, Ethan. 36 and ruling the world." Charles grinned, handing him the glass. "The team wanted to take you out tonight. We've reserved the VIP section at the Crystal." The Crystal was the most exclusive club in Manhattan. Ethan had been there countless times, always surrounded by the same crowd. Businessmen looking to make deals and beautiful women looking to marry rich. "Fine," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "I appreciate it." Hours later, Ethan sat in the VIP section of the Crystal, nursing his third scotch. The music pulsed, executives laughed too loudly at his jokes, and women in designer dresses kept finding excuses to touch his arm. It was all so predictable, so empty. "Another drink, sir." A waitress appeared at his side. When Ethan looked up, something unexpected happened. The woman standing before him wasn't like the polished servers who usually worked at the Crystal. She wore the same uniform, but there was something different about her, something real. "I'm fine," he said, but found himself unable to look away. She was pretty in an understated way. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, clear blue eyes. That didn't shy away from his gaze. "Let me know if you change your mind," she said with a small smile, turning to leave. "Wait." The word escaped before he could stop it. "What's your name?" "Maggie." "Maggie Hayes," she answered, looking surprised that he would ask. "Maggie," he repeated. "How long have you been working here?" "Just started this week. It's my second job." She glanced at the manager, watching her from across the room. "I should get back to work." As she walked away, Charles slid into the seat beside him. "Checking out the new waitress? Not your usual type." "What do you know about my type?" Ethan asked, irritated by his friend's tone. Charles laughed. "Tall, blonde, polished, usually carrying a designer bag that costs more than most people's monthly rent." Ethan didn't respond, his eyes still following Maggie as she moved through the crowd. "Want me to arrange something?" Charles offered with a knowing smile. "It is your birthday." "She's not that kind of woman," Ethan said sharply. "Everyone has a price, Ethan. You of all people should know that." The comment stung because it contained a truth Ethan had learned over and over again. In his world, everything and everyone had a price. For the rest of the night, Ethan found himself watching Maggie. She moved efficiently, always polite but never fake. When a drunk executive grabbed her wrist, Ethan was halfway out of his seat before she handled it herself, firmly removing the man's hand and walking away with dignity. As the night wound down, he made his decision. He waited until she went to the back room, then followed. "Excuse me," he said, finding her collecting her things from a locker. Maggie turned, startled. "Mr. Cade, you can't be back here." "I wanted to talk to you." He stepped closer. "In private." "About what?" She closed her locker, looking wary. "I'd like to offer you a deal." Ethan took a deep breath. $10,000 for one evening of your company." Maggie's eyes widened. "Excuse me?" "Not what you're thinking," he added quickly, seeing the flash of anger in her eyes. "Just dinner, conversation. I'll have you home by midnight." "Is this a joke?" She clutched her purse tighter. "I'm completely serious." Ethan pulled out his checkbook. "I can write the check right now." "Why would you pay $10,000 for dinner?" Maggie asked, suspicion clear in her voice. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't entirely sure himself. Because I'm tired of fake people, and you don't seem fake. Maggie laughed, the sound bitter. And you think paying for my company makes this real? No thanks, Mr. Cade. I'm not for sale. She moved past him toward the door. Wait. Ethan caught her arm gently. I apologize, that came out wrong, but the offer stands. Tomorrow night, just dinner. Maggie pulled away. Good night, Mr. Cade. Maggie's tiny apartment felt even smaller after coming from the Crystal. She kicked off her shoes, wincing at the blisters on her heels. Double shifts were killing her, but the bills kept piling up. She checked her phone and saw 3 missed calls from the hospital. Her heart raced as she dialed back. St. Mary's Hospital. This is Maggie Hayes. My father is Robert Hayes. I saw missed calls. Ms. Hayes, your father had a rough evening. His heart rate was irregular, but we've stabilized him. The doctor wants to run more tests tomorrow. More tests? Maggie closed her eyes, thinking about the stack of medical bills on her kitchen table. I'll be there first thing in the morning. After hanging up, Maggie sank onto her worn couch, fighting back tears. Her father had been in and out of the hospital for months, his heart condition worsening. The insurance covered only so much, and the experimental treatment his doctor recommended wasn't covered at all. $70,000. Might as well be 70 million. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The offer still stands. 1 dinner. $10,000, no strings attached. Ethan Cade. She stared at the message. How did he get her number? She should be offended. She should delete it immediately, but $10,000 would cover next month's hospital bills. It would give her breathing room to figure out the rest. Before she could talk herself out of it, she replied, when and where? The next evening, Ethan sent a car to pick up Maggie. He'd half expected her to cancel, but the driver confirmed she was on the way. Something about that made him smile. He hadn't told anyone about tonight. Not Charles, not his assistant, not anyone. This wasn't business. It wasn't even pleasure in the way his friends would understand. It was something else entirely. When Maggie entered his penthouse, Ethan was struck again by how different she was. She wore a simple blue dress, probably the nicest thing she owned, but nothing like what his usual dinner companions wore. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. This isn't a restaurant, she said, looking around the expansive living room. I thought we'd have more privacy here, Ethan replied. My chef has prepared dinner. I hope that's okay. Maggie nodded, still standing awkwardly by the door. So how does this work? Do I get the money now or... It's already done. Ethan gestured to an envelope on the coffee table. The full amount, as promised. Maggie picked up the envelope, checking its contents before slipping it into her purse. Thank you. Shall we eat? Ethan led her to the dining room, where the table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. Dinner was quiet at first, with Maggie offering only short answers to his questions. But as they moved to the second course, something changed. Why are you doing this? She asked suddenly. You could have any woman in that club, women who'd be thrilled to have dinner with you for free. Ethan considered the question. Because they want something from me. My money, my connections, my status. And I don't? Maggie raised an eyebrow. You're literally paying me to be here. That's different. Ethan found himself smiling. It's honest, a clear transaction. So you paid for honesty. Maggie took a sip of wine. Interesting purchase, Mr. Cade. Ethan, he corrected. And yes, I suppose I did. Well, Ethan, since you paid for honesty, here it is. This is weird. But I needed the money. So here I... Her bluntness surprised a laugh out of him. Why did you need the money? He asked, genuinely curious. Maggie hesitated. My father is sick. Heart problems. The bills keep piling up, and the treatment he needs isn't covered by insurance. I'm sorry to hear that, Ethan said, and meant it. How much is the treatment? $70,000. Maggie shook her head. I'm working 2 jobs, but it's not enough. Not even close. Ethan could write a check for that amount without thinking twice. The thought crossed his mind to offer it, but something held him back. He sensed Maggie wouldn't accept charity, especially not from him. Tell me about your father, he said instead. Something softened in Maggie's expression. He raised me alone after my mum left when I was 8. Worked 2 jobs, never missed a school event. He's everything to me. For the next hour, Ethan listened, as Maggie shared stories about her father, her childhood, her hopes for the future. She wanted to open a small bookstore someday, a dream that seemed further away with each medical bill. "Your turn," she said eventually. "What's the story of Ethan Cade?" "Not much to tell," he said, uncomfortable with the shift in focus. "Built my company from the ground up. Made my first million at 25. "That's your resume," Maggie pointed. "Out." "Not your story." No one had ever called him out like that before. Ethan found himself telling her things he rarely shared, about growing up with parents who valued achievement over affection, about the loneliness that came with success, about the emptiness of having everything and nothing at the same time. When they moved to the balcony for coffee, the city lights spread out before them. Ethan realized it was the most honest conversation he'd had in years. "It's getting late," Maggie said, checking her watch. "I should go." Already? Ethan was surprised to find he didn't want the evening to end. "It's almost midnight. You promised to have me home by then, Cinderella style." Maggie smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Can I see you again?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. Maggie's smile faded. "Ethan, this was a one-time deal. You've been very generous, but this isn't real life." "It could be," he said, stepping closer. "Let me help with your father's treatment." Her expression hardened. "I didn't tell you about my dad so you could play. Hero? I'm not a charity case." "That's not what I meant," Ethan said, frustrated by his inability to express what he was feeling. "I just want to see you again." "Why?" Maggie challenged. "Because I'm a novelty, the waitress who didn't fall at your feet." "Because you're the first person in years who's made me feel something real," Ethan admitted. The honesty in his voice seemed to reach her. Maggie's expression softened slightly. "I can't be bought, Ethan. Not for a night, not for longer." "Then have dinner with me tomorrow. No money involved. Just 2 people getting to know each other." Maggie hesitated, then shook her head. "I have to work, both jobs." "The next night, then." "Or lunch, whenever you're free." A small smile tugged at her lips. "You don't give up easily, do you?" "It's how I built my empire," Ethan said, returning her smile. "One more dinner," Maggie agreed finally. "As equals, no money changing hands." "Deal." Ethan felt a surge of something unfamiliar. It took him a moment to recognize it as happiness. As he walked her to the door, Ethan felt an urge to kiss her, but restrained himself. This fragile connection was too important to rush. "Good night, Ethan," Maggie said, stepping into the elevator. "Good night, Maggie." After she left, Ethan returned to his balcony, looking out at the city that had always felt like his kingdom. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. What Ethan didn't see was the figure watching from across the street. Victoria Reed, his ex-girlfriend and business rival, lowered her binoculars with a frown. "Who is she?" she murmured, watching Maggie get into a taxi. Victoria took out her phone and dialed. "Charles, it's Victoria. I need information on a woman Ethan was with tonight. Looks like no one special, but he had her at his penthouse." She paused, listening. "Find out everything you can. I want to know who she is, where she came from, and what she wants from him." Victoria hung up, her perfectly manicured nails tapping. Against the car window. Ethan Cade had humiliated her when he ended their relationship 6 months ago. Now she was close to completing a business deal that would destroy him, and no ordinary waitress was going to get in her way. Maggie rushed through the hospital corridor, her heart pounding. The call had come just as she was starting her morning shift at the diner. Her father had taken a turn for the worse. "Ms. Hayes," Dr. Reynolds greeted her outside her father's room. His expression was grave. "Your father suffered another episode early this morning. Is he—" Maggie couldn't finish the sentence. "He's stable for now, but I won't sugarcoat this. Without the specialized treatment we discussed, his condition will continue to deteriorate." Dr. Reynolds handed her a folder. "These are the latest test results. His heart is getting weaker." Maggie entered the room where her father lay. Robert Hayes, once a strong, vibrant man, now looked frail against the white hospital sheets. His eyes brightened when he saw her. "There's my girl," he said, his voice weak but warm. "Don't look so worried. I'm tougher than I look." Maggie forced a smile, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "The doctor says you've been causing trouble again." "These nurses don't know how to take a joke," he replied with a wink before his face grew serious. "Maggie, we need to talk about the bills. I saw how much they're charging. It's too much." "Don't worry about the money, Dad. I've got it covered." Robert frowned. "How? You're already working yourself to the bone with 2 jobs. Maggie thought of the envelope in her purse with Ethan's money. She'd deposited it that morning, still feeling conflicted about the whole arrangement. "I got a bonus at the club," she lied, "and the diner is giving me more hours." "Maggie, no arguments. You focus on getting better." She squeezed his hand. "I'm handling it." After promising to return that evening, Maggie left the hospital and checked her phone. There was a message from Ethan asking if they were still on for dinner that night. With everything happening with her father, she considered cancelling, but something made her text back a confirmation. She needed something normal, something good, even if just for a few hours. In his office at Cade Enterprises, Ethan found himself checking his phone more often than usual. When Maggie's reply came confirming their dinner, he smiled. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Charles Wilson entered without waiting for an invitation. "You look cheerful today," Charles observed, taking a seat across from Ethan. "Good. Birthday?" "It was fine," Ethan replied, not wanting to share details of his evening with Maggie. "Interesting," Charles said, leaning forward, "because I got a call from Victoria Reed last night. She saw you with someone. A waitress from the Crystal." Ethan's jaw tightened. "My personal life isn't company business, Charles. It is when Victoria Reed is involved. You know she's still furious about your breakup." Charles lowered his voice. "And there are rumors she's working on a deal with Global Tech to undercut our new software launch." "Let her try," Ethan said dismissively. "We've beaten her before." "She fights dirty, Ethan. Always has." Charles hesitated. "This waitress, her name is Maggie." Ethan interrupted. "Maggie," Charles corrected himself. "Is it serious?" "We've had one dinner," Ethan said, standing up to end the conversation. "And again, it's not your concern. Just be careful," Charles warned, heading for the door. "Victoria will use anyone she can to get to you." After Charles left, Ethan's good mood had evaporated. He'd worked hard to build his company, and Victoria Reed had been trying to tear it down ever since their relationship ended. Their breakup had been messy. Victoria had been more interested in the merger between their companies than in Ethan himself. He wouldn't let her threaten Maggie. Reaching for his phone, he made a call to his head of security. To Victoria. Reed sat in her sleek office, reviewing the information her private investigator had compiled on Maggie Hayes. Waitress at the Crystal and a diner, father in the hospital with heart problems, mountains of medical debt. Victoria smiled coldly. How convenient for Ethan. A damsel in distress. Her assistant Rebecca cleared her throat. "Mr. Turner from Global Tech is on line 1. He wants to know if we're moving forward with the deal." "Tell him we are. I have the inside information we need." Victoria tapped her manicured nails on the report. "And I think I just found another way to ensure our success." After Rebecca left, Victoria picked up her phone and dialed a new number. "St. Mary's Hospital, please. I'd like to make a donation for a patient's treatment. Robert Hayes." Maggie arrived at the restaurant Ethan had chosen, feeling out of place among the well-dressed patrons. She'd gone home to change after visiting her father, putting on the same blue dress from the night before. It was the nicest thing she owned. Ethan was waiting at a private table in the back. He stood when he saw her, and the genuine smile that lit up his face made Maggie's heart skip. "You look beautiful," he said, pulling out her chair. "It's the same dress as yesterday," Maggie admitted with a small laugh. "My wardrobe isn't exactly extensive. It's not the dress," Ethan said softly. "It's you." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. In the harsh light of day, she'd told herself that their connection the night before had been a fantasy, that a man like Ethan Cade couldn't possibly be interested in someone like her. Yet here he was, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. "How's your father?" Ethan asked as they ordered. "Not good," Maggie admitted, the worry she'd been holding at bay rushing back. "He needs that treatment sooner rather than later, but She trailed off, not wanting to talk about money again. "But you're still short," Ethan finished for her. Maggie nodded. "The 10,000 helps, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what we need." Ethan looked like he wanted to say something, then changed his mind. Instead, he asked about her day, about her other job at the diner, about her dreams for the future. And Maggie found herself opening up again, telling him things she rarely shared with anyone. "A bookstore, huh?" Ethan said when she described her long-time dream. "What kind?" "Nothing fancy. Just a small place with good books and comfortable chairs. A place where people can escape for a while." Maggie smiled at the thought. "My dad and I used to spend every Saturday at this little bookstore when I was growing up. It closed years ago, but I've never forgotten how it felt to be there." As they talked, Maggie began to see beyond Ethan's wealth and power to the person underneath. A man who had everything and yet was somehow lonely. After dinner, Ethan suggested a walk. The night was clear and cool, and Maggie found herself relaxing as they strolled along the riverfront. "This is nice," she said quietly. "Normal. Is that what you want?" "Normal?" Ethan asked, his hand brushing against hers. "I don't even know what normal looks like anymore," Maggie admitted. "Between my 2 jobs and my dad's condition, every day is just survival." Ethan took her hand gently. "Let me help you, Maggie. Not because I'm trying to buy your affection, but because I can." Maggie stopped walking, pulling her hand away. "I can't take your money, Ethan. Last night was a one-time thing, and even that felt—" She struggled to find the right word. "Wrong?" Ethan supplied, his expression falling. "Complicated," Maggie corrected. "I like you more than I should after just 2 dinners. But if I take your money now, how will I ever know if what's between us is real or if I'm just grateful?" "I understand," Ethan said after a moment. "But I'm not giving up on this. On us." Before Maggie could respond, her phone rang. It was the hospital. "Ms. Hayes, this is Nurse Jenkins from St. Mary's. I'm calling with good news. Someone has anonymously donated the full amount for your father's treatment. We can start tomorrow." Maggie's legs nearly gave out. "What? Who would do that?" The donor wished to remain anonymous. "But everything is covered, the treatment, the hospital stay, even the follow-up care." After hanging up, Maggie turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with tears. "Did you do this?" Ethan looked genuinely confused. "Do what?" "Someone just donated $70,000 for my father's treatment." Maggie searched his face. "Was it you?" "It wasn't me," Ethan said, looking troubled. "But that's quite a coincidence." "If it wasn't you, then who?" Maggie wiped away tears of relief that had begun to fall. "No one else knows about us, about my dad's condition." Ethan's expression darkened. "Actually, someone does." The next morning, Victoria Reed entered St. Mary's Hospital with a small bouquet of flowers. She approached the reception desk with her most charming smile. "I'm here to see Robert Hayes. I'm a friend of his daughter." The nurse directed her to room 302. Victoria knocked softly before entering. Robert Hayes looked up from his book, clearly confused by her presence. "Mr. Hayes, I'm—" "Victoria Reed." She placed the flowers on his bedside table. "I'm a friend of Maggie's." "Are you?" Robert didn't seem convinced. "Maggie's never mentioned you." "We're new friends," Victoria said smoothly, taking a seat beside his bed. "I heard about your condition and wanted to see how you were doing." "Better, apparently," Robert said, still wary. "The doctors say someone donated money for a new treatment. Maggie thinks it was her new friend, but he denied it." "New friend?" Victoria asked innocently. Robert's expression softened. "Some businessman she met at that fancy club where she works. She won't tell me much, but I haven't seen her smile like that in a long time. She must be very special to have such devoted friends," Victoria said. "Anonymous donors, businessmen taking her to dinner." "Maggie's always been special," Robert agreed, pride evident in his voice. "But she deserves better than working 2 jobs just to keep me alive." Victoria leaned forward, her voice sympathetic. "It must be hard, knowing she's sacrificing so much for you." "It keeps me up at night," Robert admitted. "She should be living her own life, not tied down by an old man with a bad heart." "What if she didn't have to choose?" Victoria suggested. "What if you could get your treatment and Maggie could have her freedom?" Robert's eyes narrowed. "What are you really doing here, Ms. Reed?" Before Victoria could answer, the door opened and Maggie walked in. She froze when she saw Victoria. "Who are you?" Maggie demanded. Victoria stood, extending her hand. "Victoria Reed. I was just introducing myself to your father." Maggie didn't take the offered hand. "I don't know you, but you know Ethan Cade," Victoria said, her smile never wavering. "And Ethan and I are old friends." "Victoria," Ethan's voice came from the doorway, his expression hard as he entered the room. "What a surprise." "Ethan, what perfect timing." Victoria turned to Maggie. "I was just about to tell Maggie about our history together." The tension in the room was palpable. Robert looked between the three of them, confusion and concern on his face. "Would someone tell me what's going on?" he asked. Ethan stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, I'm Ethan Cade. I apologize for the intrusion." He turned to Victoria. "We should continue this conversation elsewhere." "Oh, but we're just getting to the good part," Victoria said, her eyes gleaming. "Like how you paid Maggie $10,000 for a date." Maggie paled. "What?" "Victoria, that's enough," Ethan warned. "Dad, this isn't what—" Maggie began, but Victoria cut her off. "Did she tell you she was desperate for money, Ethan? That her poor father needed expensive treatment?" Victoria turned to Robert. "Did she tell you how she earned that money, Mr. Hayes?" "Get out," Maggie said, her voice shaking with anger. "Now!" "I'm just trying to clear the air," Victoria said innocently. "After all, there shouldn't be secrets between friends." "Ms. Reed," Robert said, his voice weak but firm, "I think you should leave." Victoria picked up her purse, pausing at the door. "By the way, Ethan, I had a lovely meeting with Global Tech yesterday. They're very interested in our partnership. We'll be announcing it next week." After she left, the room fell silent. Robert looked pale and Maggie rushed to his side. "Dad, are you okay? Do you need the nurse?" "I'm fine," he said, though his voice was strained. "What was that woman talking about, Maggie? What does she mean about you earning money?" Maggie looked at Ethan, who stood awkwardly by the door. "It's complicated, Dad." "Mr. Hayes," Ethan said, stepping forward, "this situation is my fault, not your daughter's. I asked Maggie to have dinner with me and offered to pay her, knowing she needed money for your treatment." "Ethan, don't," Maggie pleaded. "He deserves the truth," Ethan insisted. "Nothing inappropriate happened, Mr. Hayes. It was just dinner. But I was wrong to put Maggie in that position." Robert looked at his daughter. "Is this true?" Maggie nodded, tears in her eyes. "I was desperate, Dad. The bills kept piling up and I didn't know what else to do. And now?" Robert asked, looking between them. "What is this now?" "Now I care about your daughter," Ethan said simply, "and I'd like a chance to prove that to both of you." Robert's expression was unreadable. "Maggie, could you give us a minute alone?" "Dad." "Please, sweetheart." Reluctantly, Maggie left the room. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, trying to process everything that had just happened. Victoria Reed had deliberately tried to humiliate her in front of her father. But why? Inside the room, Robert fixed Ethan with a hard stare. "My daughter is not for sale, Mr. Cade." "I know that now," Ethan admitted. "I was wrong, but what I feel for Maggie is real." "And what exactly do you feel for her?" Robert challenged. "Because she's not a toy or a charity case." "I'm beginning to understand that," Ethan said quietly. "Maggie sees me, not my money or my company, but me. Do you know how rare that is in my world?" Robert's expression softened slightly. "She's always had that gift, seeing the person behind the facade." "I didn't mean to hurt her or you," Ethan said, "and I had nothing to do with the anonymous donation, although I wish I had thought of it." "If not you, then who?" Robert asked, suspicious again. "That woman, Victoria?" "I believe so," Ethan admitted, "but not out of kindness. Victoria and I have a complicated history. She'll use anyone to get to me, including Maggie. And my daughter is caught in the middle." Robert shook his head. "I don't like this, Mr. Cade." "Neither do I," Ethan agreed. "But I promise you, I will protect Maggie." Before Robert could respond, the door opened and Dr. Reynolds entered. "Mr. Hayes, we need to prepare you for the first treatment." Ethan took that as his cue to leave. In the hallway, he found Maggie pacing anxiously. "What did he say?" she asked. "He's protective of you," Ethan said with a small smile. "As he should be." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry about all this. That woman, Victoria, who is she to you?" "My ex," Ethan admitted, "and my biggest business rival. She's been trying to destroy my company since we broke up 6 months ago. And now she's using me to get to you," Maggie realized. "She's the one who donated the money for my dad's treatment." "Believe so," Ethan confirmed. "The question is, what does she want in return?" As if on cue, Maggie's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dinner tomorrow. 8 p.m. The Meridian Hotel. Come alone. We need to talk about your father's treatment." Victoria Reed Maggie showed the message to Ethan, her face pale. "What do I do?" Ethan's expression hardened. "You're not going alone. This ends now." Charles Wilson sat in his car outside St. Mary's Hospital, watching Ethan and Maggie through his binoculars. When his phone rang, he answered. Immediately. "They're together at the hospital," he reported. "Looks like your plan worked." "Perfect," Victoria's voice came through the speaker. "Keep an eye on them. I want to know their every move." "What about the deal with Global Tech?" Charles asked. "It's proceeding as planned," Victoria assured him. "By this time next week, Cade Enterprises will be on its knees, and Ethan will have lost everything. His company, his reputation, and his little waitress." "And my position as CEO?" Charles pressed. "Guaranteed, as we agreed, as long as you keep delivering what I need." Charles ended the call, a smile spreading across his face. For years he'd stood in Ethan's shadow, always the loyal second in command. But soon that would change. Soon he would be the one in power, and neither Ethan nor Victoria would see it coming. Inside the hospital, Ethan held Maggie close as she cried softly against his chest. Despite the chaos Victoria had created, despite the uncertain future ahead, one thing was clear to both of them. What had started as a transaction had become something neither of them had expected, something real. But with Victoria's schemes, Charles's betrayal, and the fragile nature of their new connection, the question remained, could their relationship survive the storm that was coming? The Meridian Hotel's restaurant sparkled with crystal chandeliers and fine china. Victoria Reed sat at a corner table, checking her diamond watch impatiently. She had chosen this location carefully, public enough to prevent a scene, exclusive, enough that Maggie would feel uncomfortable. The sight of Maggie entering the restaurant alone brought a satisfied smile to Victoria's face. The waitress looked out of place in her simple dress, drawing curious glances from the other diners. "Maggie, thank you for coming," Victoria said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." Maggie remained standing. "I'm only here because of my father. What do you want?" "So direct," Victoria commented, sipping her champagne. "I can see why Ethan finds you refreshing." She motioned again to the chair. "Sit. People are staring." Reluctantly, Maggie sat down, her posture stiff. "Was it you? Did you pay for my father's treatment?" "I did," Victoria admitted easily. "Consider it a gesture of goodwill." "Why would you do that?" Maggie asked, suspicious. Victoria leaned forward. "Because I understand what it's like to do anything for someone you love. Your father needed help, and I was in a position to provide." "Chance you don't know me or my father," Maggie said. "What do you really want?" A waiter approached with menus, but Victoria waved him away. "We won't be dining. Just bring us coffee." When the waiter left, Victoria's pleasant expression hardened. "You're right. I want something in return. I want you to stay away from Ethan Cade." Maggie blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. "Excuse me?" "Ethan and I have history," Victoria explained. "Complex, important history. What you two have is a fling, a rich man's fascination with someone different. It won't last." "If you're so confident about that, why are you here?" Maggie challenged. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Because Ethan is distracted and I need him focused. We have business matters to resolve." "This isn't about business," Maggie said, seeing through the lie. "This is personal." "Perhaps," Victoria conceded, "but that doesn't change the facts. You're a waitress from nowhere with nothing to offer someone like Ethan Cade except temporary entertainment." The words stung, but Maggie refused to show it. "If that's true, then why do you feel threatened by me?" Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment. "I'm not threatened, I'm practical. Ethan needs someone who understands his world, his ambitions. Someone like you? Maggie asked. Precisely. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a check. I'm prepared to be generous. $100,000 for your father's ongoing care and for you to pursue that little bookstore dream Ethan mentioned. Maggie stared at the check in disbelief. You want to pay me to stop seeing Ethan? I prefer to think of it as compensating you for your time, Victoria said smoothly. After all, you've already established that your company has a price. The reference to her initial arrangement with Ethan made Maggie flush with anger. You don't know anything about me or what's between Ethan and me. I know more than you think, Victoria replied. I know about the 2 jobs, the tiny apartment, the student loans you're still paying off. I know your father will need ongoing care even after this treatment. I know how hard you've worked for so little. She pushed the check closer. This is freedom, Maggie. Take it. Maggie looked at the check, her mind racing. The amount was life-changing. It would secure her father's future, pay off all their debts, maybe even provide a down payment for that. Bookstore. For a brief moment, she considered it. Then she thought of Ethan. Not his money or his power, but the man who had opened up to her about his lonely childhood, who looked at her like she was something precious. No, Maggie said finally, standing up. I'm not for sale, Ms. Reed. Not to Ethan, and certainly not to you. Victoria's expression hardened. Don't be a fool. Men like Ethan don't end up with women like you. He'll grow bored, or his board of directors will pressure him to find someone more suitable. You're setting yourself up for heartbreak. Maybe, Maggie admitted, but that's my choice to make. As she turned to leave, Victoria called after her. Your father's treatment is still covered. I'm not a monster, Maggie, but remember this conversation when Ethan eventually moves on. Outside the restaurant, Maggie took a deep breath of the night. Hair fighting back tears. A familiar car pulled up to the curb and Ethan stepped out, concern etched on his face. Are you okay? He asked, moving to her side. What happened? Maggie fell into his embrace, the emotions of the evening finally overwhelming her. She tried to buy me off, she said against his chest. $100,000 to stay away from you. Ethan's body tensed. I'm so sorry, Maggie. This is my fault. No. Maggie pulled back to look at him. It's hers. She's manipulative and cruel. That's Victoria. Ethan agreed grimly. What did you tell her? That I'm not for sale, Maggie said, a small smile breaking through her tears. To anyone. Ethan's expression softened with relief and something deeper. I'm glad to hear that. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Come on, let me take you home. Neither of them noticed the photographer across the street or the click of his camera capturing their embrace. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Cade Enterprises earlier than usual. He needed time to think before the day's meetings. Victoria's confrontation with Maggie had crossed a line, and he needed to prepare for whatever she planned next. He was surprised to find Charles already in his office, looking troubled. We have a problem, Charles said without preamble, tossing a tabloid onto Ethan's desk. The headline screamed, "Billionaire's Secret Arrangement with Waitress." Below it was a photo of Ethan and Maggie embracing outside the Meridian Hotel, alongside a smaller picture of Maggie in her waitress uniform at the Crystal. Ethan's stomach dropped as he scanned the article. It detailed how he had paid for companionship and hinted at an ongoing arrangement between them. There were quotes from anonymous sources close to the couple, describing Maggie as a gold digger who had set her sights on one of the city's most eligible bachelors. This is Victoria's doing, Ethan said, his voice tight with anger. Without question, Charles agreed. But that's not our biggest problem. The board is in an uproar. I've been fielding calls all morning from concerned investors. My personal life is none of their business, Ethan snapped. It is when it affects the company, Charles countered. Fair or not, your reputation impacts Cade Enterprises. And with the global tech deal already causing market jitters, Ethan looked up sharply. What global tech deal? Charles hesitated. You hadn't heard. Victoria announced a partnership with Global Tech yesterday. They're launching a product similar to our new software, but 3 months ahead of our schedule. That's impossible, Ethan said, his mind racing. Unless... A cold realization dawned on him. unless she had inside information. My thoughts. Exactly, Charles said, looking appropriately concerned. Someone within Cade Enterprises must be feeding her information. Find out who, Ethan ordered, standing up. I want a full security audit. Check everyone who had access to the development. Timeline. Already in progress, Charles assured him. What about the tabloid story? The board wants to meet this afternoon to discuss potential damage control. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, thinking of Maggie. She hadn't asked for any of this. I need to warn Maggie before she sees this. She's already dealing with enough with her father's health. Ethan, Charles said carefully, maybe Victoria has a point. Not about buying Maggie off, of course, but about timing. With everything happening with the company, is this really the best time for a new relationship? Especially one that's drawing this kind of attention? Are you suggesting I end things with Maggie to appease the board? Ethan asked incredulously. I'm suggesting you consider all angles, Charles replied. Your relationship with Maggie has made you vulnerable. Victoria is exploiting that. I'm not giving Victoria the satisfaction, Ethan said firmly, and I'm not abandoning Maggie because of a tabloid story. Charles nodded, though he didn't look convinced. I'll set up the board meeting for 3 o'clock, and Ethan, be prepared. They're not going to go easy on you. After Charles left, Ethan called Maggie, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried the diner where she worked, but was told she hadn't come in for her shift. Worried, he decided to go find her in person. As he was leaving his office, his assistant stopped him. Mr. Cade, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. In the waiting area stood Robert Hayes, Maggie's father. He looked pale but determined, a copy of the tabloid clutched in his hand. Mr. Hayes, Ethan said, surprised. You should be in the hospital. Your treatment, they let me out for... A few hours, Robert interrupted. We need to talk about my daughter. Ethan led him into his office, closing the door for privacy. Mr. Hayes, I want you to know that story is full of lies. Victoria Reed is trying to hurt me by hurting Maggie. I figured as much, Robert said, sitting down heavily. Maggie explained everything after that woman left the hospital yesterday. About how you met, about the money. Ethan sat across from him, unsure what to say. My daughter has been carrying the weight of the world since her mother left, Robert continued. Working multiple jobs, putting her dreams on hold, all to take care of me. She deserves better than becoming tabloid fodder. I agree, Ethan said sincerely. That's why I'm going to fix this. How? Robert challenged. You can't unpublish that story. You can't stop people from talking. No, but I can set the record straight, Ethan insisted. I can make it clear that Maggie did nothing wrong. At what cost to her? Robert asked. Do you have any idea what people are saying about her? The diner called this morning to tell her not to come back. They don't want the attention. Ethan felt sick. She lost her job, I didn't know. She doesn't know yet either, Robert said. She left early this morning to go to the bookstore she loves. Said she needed to clear her head. He fixed Ethan with a hard stare. My daughter is the most important thing in the world to me, Mr. Cade. I won't stand by and watch her get hurt. I don't want to hurt her, Ethan said quietly. I care about her. Then prove it, Robert challenged. Do what's best for her, not what's best for you. He stood up, wincing slightly at the movement. Think about what that means, Mr. Cade. Really think about it. After Robert left, Ethan sat alone in his office, the weight of his words settling heavily on his shoulders. Do what's best for her. But what was best for Maggie? Staying away from her would stop the tabloid stories, but it would also mean letting Victoria win. It would mean losing the most real connection he'd had in years. His phone rang. It was Charles reminding him about the board meeting. With a heavy heart, Ethan headed to the conference room, still uncertain about what to do. Maggie sat in the back corner of Turning Pages, the small bookstore where she'd spent countless hours over the years. It was her sanctuary, the one place where she could escape when life became too much. Today, surrounded by the comforting smell of books, she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Her phone had been buzzing all morning with texts and calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She'd turned it off after the third reporter asked for her side of the arrangement with Ethan Cade. Maggie? A familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. Eleanor Wilson, the elderly owner of the bookstore, stood beside her table with concern in her eyes. Are you all right, dear? I've been better, Maggie admitted with a weak smile. Eleanor sat down across from her, placing a cup of tea on the table. I saw the paper this morning. Nasty business, those tabloids. Maggie's heart sank. You saw it too? Hard to miss, Eleanor said gently. But I know better than to believe such nonsense. It's not all nonsense, Maggie said quietly. I did have dinner with Ethan Cade, and he did pay me, but it wasn't what they're making it out to be. Eleanor patted her hand. You don't owe me an explanation, dear. I feel like I owe everyone an explanation, Maggie said, her voice breaking. The diner hasn't called me for today's shift. The hospital staff was whispering when I visited Dad. This morning, even my neighbors were giving me strange looks. People love scandal, Eleanor said wisely. It makes their own lives seem less ordinary. They'll move on to something else soon enough. I hope so, Maggie said, though she wasn't convinced. I just never expected any of this. 2 weeks ago, I was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. Now I'm being called a gold digger in the tabloids. And what does Ethan Cade have to say about all this? Eleanor asked. I don't know, Maggie admitted. I haven't spoken to him since last night. My phone's been so full of messages from reporters that I turned it off. Eleanor considered her for a moment. Do you care about him, Maggie? The real? Him, not the billionaire. Maggie nodded, surprised by the tears that sprang to her eyes. I do. He's not what I expected. Behind all that wealth and power, he's just lonely, looking for something real. And are you that something real? Eleanor pressed gently. I thought I could be, Maggie whispered. But now I don't know. His world is so different from mine. Maybe Victoria Reed is right. Maybe I don't belong in his life. Nonsense, Eleanor said firmly. Love doesn't care about bank accounts or social status. Love, Maggie repeated, startled. I never said anything about love. Eleanor's eyes twinkled. You didn't have to, dear. It's written all over your face. Before Maggie could respond, the bell above the bookstore door jingled. A tall man in an expensive suit entered, looking around with purpose. Can I help you? Eleanor called out. I'm looking for Maggie Hayes, the man said, approaching their table. Maggie tensed. Who are you? James Lawton, head of security for Cade Enterprises, he introduced himself. Mr. Cade asked me to find you. He's been trying to reach you. Is Ethan okay? Maggie asked, suddenly worried. He's in a board meeting right now, James explained. But he's concerned about you, especially after the tabloid story broke. He asked me to bring you to his penthouse, where you can have privacy until he's able to join you. Maggie hesitated, looking at Eleanor for guidance. Go, the older woman encouraged. You two need to talk. With a grateful nod to Eleanor, Maggie followed James out to a waiting car with tinted windows. As they pulled away from the curb, she didn't notice the second car that fell into place behind them, or Charles Wilson watching from inside it. The board meeting was going exactly as badly as Ethan had expected. The 12 members of Cade Enterprises' board of directors sat around the large conference table, expressions ranging from disapproval to open hostility. This is precisely the kind of publicity we don't need right now, Richard Donovan, the oldest board member, was saying. With the global tech announcement yesterday, our stock is already down 7 points. This tabloid scandal is just adding fuel to the fire. My personal life has nothing to do with the company's performance, Ethan argued. It does when you're the face of the company, Patricia Wells countered. Fair or not, your actions reflect on all of us, and paying for companionship. That's not what happened, Ethan interrupted sharply. Maggie Hayes is not what these tabloids are making her out to be. Then what is she? Richard challenged. A waitress you met at a club and suddenly decided to date. The timing is suspicious, Ethan. Right when Victoria Reed announces a major deal that threatens our market position. Are you suggesting Maggie is working with Victoria? Ethan asked incredulously. The board members exchanged glances. It was Charles who finally spoke up. We're just concerned about the coincidence. Victoria Reed is cunning. She could be using this woman to distract you, to gain access to company information. That's absurd, Ethan said firmly. Maggie has nothing to do with Victoria's schemes. Can you be certain? Patricia pressed. How well do you really know this woman? The question hit harder than Ethan expected. He had known Maggie for barely 2 weeks, but in that short time he'd shared more with her than he had with anyone in years. He trusted her instinctively, I know enough, he said finally. And I won't throw her to the wolves to appease the board or the press. Richard leaned forward. Ethan, no one is asking you to do that. But the board feels that, given the current situation with global tech, you should consider taking a step back from this relationship until things settle down. You want me to break things off with Maggie, Ethan clarified, his voice dangerously quiet. We want you focused on saving the company, Richard corrected. Victoria Reed is launching a competing product 3 months before ours. That should be your priority right now, not a new relationship. Ethan stood up abruptly. I don't need the board's approval of my personal life, and I'm fully capable of handling both Victoria Reed and my relationship with Maggie. Ethan, Charles said, his voice placating, no one is questioning your capabilities. But perhaps a brief pause would be best for everyone, including Maggie. Give the press time to move on to something else. Ethan looked around the table, taking in the concerned faces of the board members. They weren't wrong about the timing being terrible. With Victoria launching her competing product early, Cade Enterprises was facing a serious threat, and the tabloid scandal was a distraction he didn't need. But the thought of walking away from Maggie even temporarily felt wrong. I need time to think, he said finally. This meeting is adjourned. As the board members filed out, Charles lingered behind. For what it's worth, I think you're making the right decision by considering all angles. I haven't made any decision yet, Ethan said sharply. And before I do, I need to talk to Maggie. Charles nodded. Of course. By the way, James texted me. He found Maggie and took her to your penthouse as requested. Thank you, Ethan said, gathering his things. I'm heading there now. Cancel my other meetings for today. After Ethan left, Charles made a phone call. Victoria, everything's going according to plan. Ethan's on his way to the penthouse now. Perfect, Victoria purred. And our other guest? Already waiting, Charles confirmed. Are you sure about this? It seems extreme even for you. Do you want to be CEO or not? Victoria demanded. You know I do, Charles said quickly. Then stop questioning me. By tomorrow morning, Ethan Cade will have lost everything that matters. To him, his company, his reputation, and his waitress. Maggie paced the length of Ethan's penthouse living room, uneasy despite the luxury surrounding her. James Lawton had left her there with assurances that Ethan would arrive soon, but something felt off. She tried turning on her phone, wincing at the flood of notifications that immediately appeared. Among them was a missed call from her father. She dialed his number immediately. Dad, is everything okay? Maggie, where are you? Robert's voice was tense. I'm at Ethan's penthouse, she explained. His security person found me at the bookstore and said Ethan wanted to see me. There was a pause. Did he mention me visiting Ethan at his office this morning? No, Maggie said, confused. You went to see Ethan? Why? I saw the tabloid, sweetheart. I wanted to make sure he understood what was at stake. Robert's voice softened. I know you care about him, but I'm worried about you. I know, Dad, Maggie said, but I need to talk to Ethan myself before making any decisions. Just be careful, Robert warned. That Victoria woman is dangerous. She called the hospital again, asking questions about my treatment. Maggie's blood ran cold. What kind of questions? About the payment, about whether I was satisfied with the care. It felt like she was fishing for something. Dad, I need to go, Maggie said suddenly. I'll call you back soon. She hung up, her instincts screaming that something was very wrong. Why would Victoria be asking about her father's treatment now, after their confrontation at the Meridian? The sound of the elevator arriving made her turn expectantly. But it wasn't Ethan who stepped into the penthouse. It was Victoria Reed looking triumphant. Hello, Maggie, she said with a cold smile. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I thought it was time we had another chat. How did you get in here? Maggie demanded, backing away. Ethan's security isn't as reliable as he thinks, Victoria said dismissively, but that's the least of his problems right now. What are you talking about? Maggie asked, fear creeping into her voice. Victoria moved to the bar, pouring herself a drink. At this moment, Ethan is in a board meeting, likely being told to end things with you if he wants to save his company. You're lying, Maggie said, though uncertainty crept into her voice. Am I? Victoria pulled out her phone, showing Maggie a text message from Charles. Board advising E to end relationship. He's considering it. Maggie felt like she'd been punched. Why are you doing this? What did I ever do to you? It's not about you, Victoria said almost kindly. It's about Ethan. He humiliated me when he ended our relationship, chose his company over our merger. Now he's going to lose both the company and you. You're behind the global tech deal, Maggie realized. You're trying to destroy his company. With help from the inside, Victoria confirmed. Charles has been feeding me information for months. Poor Ethan, surrounded by people he trusts, never realizing they're all just waiting for him to fall. The elevator chimed again, and this time it was Ethan who stepped into the penthouse. He froze when he saw Victoria. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded. Just having a girl talk with Maggie, Victoria said lightly. Explaining how things work in our world, Ethan moved to Maggie's side. Are you okay? Before Maggie could answer, Victoria spoke. Why don't you tell her about the board meeting, Ethan? About how they want you to end things with her to save the company? Ethan's jaw tightened. That's between me and Maggie. So it's true, Maggie said quietly, stepping away from him. They asked you to break up with me. Maggie, it's not that simple, Ethan began. Actually, it is, Victoria interrupted. Your board doesn't approve of your waitress girlfriend. They think she's bad for business. And given the stock price drop today, they might be right. Victoria, that's enough, Ethan snapped. This is none of your business. Oh, but it is, Victoria said, her smile widening. Because I'm the one who's going to take everything from you, just like you took everything from me. I didn't take anything from you, Ethan argued. You were the one who only wanted the merger, not me. Liar. Victoria's composure cracked. You promised me everything. Marriage, a combined company, a future. Then you changed your mind and walked away like it meant nothing. Maggie looked between them, the pieces falling into place. This isn't about business at all. It's about revenge. Smart girl, Victoria said, regaining her composure. Yes, it's about revenge. The global tech deal, the tabloid story, even your father's treatment, all part of my plan to make Ethan suffer. My father's treatment? Maggie repeated, her voice shaking. What about it? Victoria's smile turned cruel. Did you really think I'd give $70,000 to a stranger out of the goodness of my heart? The payment was conditional, Maggie, and you failed to meet the conditions when you refused my offer. What are you saying? Ethan demanded, moving protectively closer to Maggie. I'm saying the payment for Robert Hayes' treatment has been withdrawn, Victoria announced. As of this morning, your father has no coverage for his specialized care. The hospital has already been notified. Maggie felt the room spin. You can't do that. He needs that treatment. It started already. I can and I have, Victoria said coldly. But don't worry, I'm willing to reinstate it if Ethan signs over controlling interest in Cade Enterprises to me. That's blackmail, Ethan said through gritted teeth. It's business, Victoria corrected. And it's your choice, Ethan, your company or her father's life. What's it going to be? The room fell silent as the weight of Victoria's ultimatum settled over them. Maggie looked at Ethan, saw the conflict raging in his eyes. His company was his life's work, everything he'd built over years of sacrifice and hard work. Ethan, don't, Maggie said quietly. We'll find another way to pay for the treatment. There is no other way, Victoria said confidently, not in time to save your father. The specialized medication needs to be administered continuously. Even a day's interruption could be catastrophic for someone in his condition. Ethan's expression hardened as he made his decision. Where are the papers? Ethan. No, Maggie protested. Right here, Victoria said, pulling a folder from her purse. All ready for your signature. As Ethan reached for the folder, the elevator chimed once more. James Lawton stepped out, followed by 2 police officers. Victoria Reed? One of the officers said. We have some questions about your involvement in corporate espionage and blackmail. Victoria's triumphant expression faltered. What is this? Ethan stepped back, a small smile forming. Did you really think I wouldn't have security? In my own penthouse, Victoria? Every word you just said has been recorded. You can't prove anything, Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. Actually, we can, James said, holding up his phone. We've been tracking the money transfers between your accounts and Charles Wilson's, and we have evidence that he accessed confidential company files before those same details showed up in your deal with Global Tech. Charles, Ethan looked stunned. He was working with you? Mr. Wilson is already in custody, the second officer confirmed. He's been quite cooperative, hoping for leniency. As the officers led a protesting Victoria away, Maggie sank onto the couch, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Ethan sat beside her, taking her hands in his. I'm so sorry, Maggie, about all of this. My dad's treatment, she said, her voice small. If Victoria withdraws the payment, I'll cover it, Ethan promised. I should have done that from the beginning, not because I'm trying to buy your affection, but because I care about you and your father. Maggie looked at him uncertainly. What about your board? They still want you to end things with me. They'll have to accept my decision, Ethan said firmly. Because I'm not walking away from you, Maggie. Not for the board, not for the company, not for anything. But the tabloids, the scandal, will pass, Ethan assured her. What's between us is real, that's all that matters. He leaned forward, gently cupping her face in his hands. For the first time since they'd met, he kissed her, not as a billionaire, not as a man who had once tried to buy her time, but as someone who had found something precious and wasn't willing to let it go. The kiss was soft, tender, a promise of something new beginning. When they pulled apart, Maggie saw a vulnerability in Ethan's eyes that he rarely showed to anyone. I know this has all happened so fast, he said quietly, but I'm falling in love with you, Maggie Hayes, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. Before Maggie could respond, her phone rang. It was the hospital. With shaking hands, she answered, fearing the worst about her father's treatment. Ms. Hayes, this is Dr. Reynolds. I wanted to let you know there's been some confusion about your father's payment, but everything has been resolved. Mr. Cade's office called to ensure the treatment continues without interruption. Relief washed over Maggie. Thank you, Doctor. How is my father doing? Very well, Dr. Reynolds assured her. The initial results are promising. With continued treatment, we're optimistic about his recovery. After hanging up, Maggie turned to Ethan with tears in her eyes. Darsinga, you already took care of it. Before you even knew if Victoria was bluffing. Ethan nodded. I called from the car on my way here. Your father's health was never going to be a bargaining chip, not if I could help it. In that moment, looking at the man before her, not the billionaire CEO, but the man who had moved mountains to protect her father, Maggie realized Eleanor had been right. What she felt for Ethan was love, unexpected and unplanned, but real. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she admitted softly. Ethan pulled her close, the stress of the day fading in the warmth of their embrace. Outside the penthouse windows, the city lights sparkled like stars, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things begin in the most unexpected ways. But even as they held each other, questions remained. With Victoria and Charles out of the picture, what would happen to Cade Enterprises? Would the board accept Ethan's decision to be with Maggie? And most importantly, could a relationship that had begun as a transaction truly transform into something lasting? The answers would come in time. For now, they had each other, and that was enough. 3 months later, the chill of autumn had settled over the city. Maggie adjusted her scarf as she unlocked the door to Second Chapter, the small bookstore she now owned in the heart of downtown. The bell jingled cheerfully as she stepped inside, flipping on the lights to reveal walls lined with bookshelves, comfortable reading nooks, and a small coffee counter in the corner. She breathed in the scent of books and coffee, still amazed that this space was hers. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of changes, some challenging, some wonderful. As she prepared the store for opening, her mind drifted back to the day after Victoria's arrest. The tabloids had shifted their focus from Maggie and Ethan's relationship to the scandal involving Victoria Reed and Charles Wilson. The headlines had been sensational. Corporate espionage at Cade Enterprises and revenge plot uncovered, billionaires. Hex arrested. It had been a difficult time for Cade Enterprises. With Charles's betrayal exposed, Ethan had been forced to restructure his executive team and reassure nervous investors. the competing product that Victoria had been developing with. Global tech had fallen apart, once her illegal methods came to light, but the damage to Ethan's company had already been done. For weeks, Ethan had worked around the clock, meeting with investors, reassuring clients, and rebuilding trust within his own company. Despite his busy schedule, he had made time for Maggie every day, even if it was just a late dinner or a phone call, and through it all he had kept his promise about her father's treatment. Robert Hayes was now well into his recovery, growing stronger each day. The doctors were optimistic that he would make a full recovery within the year. The bell above the door jingled, interrupting Maggie's thoughts. Helena Wilson, the former owner of Turning Pages, entered with a smile. "Good morning," the older woman greeted warmly. "Ready for another day?" "More than ready," Maggie replied, giving Eleanor a hug. When Ethan had offered to help Maggie open her own bookstore, she had immediately thought of Eleanor, who had been looking to retire but didn't want to close Turning Pages completely. Their partnership had been perfect. Eleanor provided the experience and inventory from her old store, while Maggie brought fresh ideas and energy. "How's your father doing?" Eleanor asked, hanging up her coat. "Much better," Maggie said happily. "The doctors say he might be able to start working part-time next month. Nothing strenuous, but it would be good for him to get out of the house." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor said. "And what about that handsome man of yours? Still working too hard?" Maggie smiled. "Always, but he's coming by for lunch today. Says he has something important to discuss." "Oh?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow suggestively. "Sounds intriguing." "It's probably just about the store," Maggie said, though her heart fluttered at the possibilities. "We're doing well, but the location is expensive." When Ethan had first suggested helping her open the bookstore, Maggie had been hesitant. She didn't want to be dependent on him, didn't want their relationship tainted by financial obligation. They had compromised. Ethan provided the initial investment as a business loan, with clear terms, and Maggie ran the store independently. So far, Second Chapter was doing better than projected, but Maggie was practical enough to know that bookstores weren't usually lucrative businesses. "Whatever it is, I'm sure you two will figure it out together," Eleanor said confidently. "You make a good team." As the morning progressed, the store filled with customers. Second Chapter had quickly become a neighborhood favorite, with its cozy atmosphere and carefully curated selection. Maggie moved between shelves, recommending books and chatting with regulars. This was her dream, and sometimes she still couldn't believe it was real. Around noon, the bell jingled again, and Ethan walked in, looking tired but happy. Despite his casual clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of his usual suit, he still drew admiring glances from some of the customers. "Hey," he said, leaning over the counter to kiss Maggie. "Busy morning?" "Very," she confirmed. "But in a good way. Eleanor's handling things now if you want to go upstairs for lunch." Above the bookstore was a small apartment that came with the lease. Maggie hadn't moved in yet. She was still staying in her old place to be close to her father, but she used the space for breaks and the occasional overnight stay. Once upstairs, Ethan visibly relaxed, the tension leaving his shoulders. "For you look happy," he observed, watching as Maggie moved around the kitchenette preparing sandwiches. "I am happy," she said simply. "The store is doing well. Dad's getting better and—" She paused, giving him a soft smile. "And I have you." Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I've missed you this week. These investor meetings are brutal." "How are things going with the company?" Maggie asked, resting her head against his chest. "Better," Ethan said. "The stock price is recovering. The new software launch is back on track for next month. The board is finally backing off." The board had been a significant hurdle in their relationship. After Victoria's arrest, they had reluctantly accepted Ethan's decision to continue seeing Maggie, but their approval had been grudging at best. Some members still believed she was a distraction, still worried about the company's image. "I'm glad," Maggie said, pulling away to finish making lunch. "You've worked so hard to fix everything." Ethan took a deep breath. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few months about the company, about what's really important." Maggie set the plates on the small table, watching him curiously. And what did you decide? That I don't want to be CEO anymore, Ethan said quietly. Maggie stared at him in shock. What? But Cade Enterprises is your life. You built it from nothing. It was my life, Ethan corrected, before I met you. Now I'm not. So sure, Ethan, Maggie said carefully. If you're doing this because of me, because of what the board thinks, I'm not, he interrupted. Or at least, not entirely. The truth is, I haven't been happy at Cade Enterprises for a long time. The constant pressure, the politics, the betrayals, it's exhausting. What happened with Charles and Victoria just brought it all to the surface. But what would you do instead? Maggie asked, sitting down across from him. Ethan smiled. I've been talking to my team about restructuring. I'd still be the majority shareholder, still be on the board, but I'd step down as CEO. Let someone else handle the day-to-day operations while I focus on new ventures. What kind of new ventures? Maggie was curious. That's the other thing I wanted to discuss with you, Ethan said, reaching for her hand across the table. How would you feel about expanding Second Chapter? Not just this location, but a whole chain of independent bookstores, Maggie blinked. A chain? But I've only been doing this for 3 months. I'm hardly an expert. You know what makes a good bookstore, Ethan countered. You understand what readers want. And Eleanor has decades of experience. Between the three of us, I think we could build something special. Something that preserves the feeling of independent bookstores while giving them the support they need to compete with the big chains. The idea was tantalizing. Maggie had seen firsthand how many small bookstores were struggling, how many had closed in recent years. It would take a lot of capital, she said thoughtfully. I have capital, Ethan reminded her with a smile. What I need is passion and expertise. You have both. You're serious about this, Maggie realized. Completely, Ethan confirmed. I want to build something new, something meaningful, with you. He squeezed her hand. Not as a silent investor, but as a true partner. Maggie's mind raced with possibilities. It would be a lot of work. We'd need to find the right locations, hire the right people, create a model that preserves what makes each store special. So you're interested? Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up. I'm intrigued, Maggie admitted. But Ethan, are you sure this is what you want? Stepping away from Cade Enterprises is a huge decision. I've never been more sure of anything, he said firmly, except for one other thing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Maggie's heart stopped as he opened it to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. Ethan, she whispered, her eyes wide. I know it's only been 3 months, he said, his voice suddenly nervous, and I know this might seem fast. But when you've spent your whole life surrounded by people who only want you for what you can give them, you recognize quickly when you've found someone who sees you for who you really are. He moved from his chair to kneel beside her. Maggie, Hayes, I love you. I love your kindness, your honesty, your strength. I love that you stood by me through everything these past months, never asking for anything in return. I love that you've made me a better man, a happier man. Tears filled Maggie's eyes as he continued. I don't care what the board thinks or what the tabloids say. I don't care about Victoria Reed or Charles Wilson or anyone else who tried to come between us. All I care about is building a life with you. Will you marry me? For a moment, Maggie couldn't speak. 3 months ago, she had been a waitress struggling to pay her father's medical bills. Now she owned a bookstore. Her father was recovering. And Ethan Cade, the man she had once thought epitomized everything wrong with the wealthy elite, was on his knee, asking her to be his wife. This is crazy, she said finally, laughing through her tears. 3 months ago, you paid me $10,000 for a dinner date, Ethan winced. Not my finest moment, he admitted. But it brought you into my life, so I can't entirely regret it. Maggie reached out to touch his face gently. I should say it's too soon. I should say we need more time. But, Ethan prompted, hope in his eyes. But I love you too, Maggie said simply. And I want to build a life. With you, whether that's running bookstores or something else entirely. She took a deep breath. Yes, Ethan, I'll marry you. The joy that spread across his face was unlike anything Maggie had ever seen. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that promised a future filled with love and partnership. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Ethan pressed his forehead against hers. "There's one more thing," he said. "I bought a house. Nothing too extravagant, I promise, but it has a garden for your father to tend when he's feeling better, and it's close enough to the store that you can walk to work." "You bought a house without telling me?" Maggie asked, surprised. "I'm not pressuring you to move in right away," Ethan assured her quickly. "I know you need to be near your father until he's fully recovered, but I wanted us to have a home, a real home, not my sterile penthouse or your tiny apartment. Somewhere we could build a life together." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Maggie deeply. It showed that Ethan understood what was important to her: family, simplicity, authenticity. "I'd like to see it," she said softly. "Our house." The word "our" brought another smile to Ethan's face. "I can take you there this evening after the store closes." They finished their lunch, talking excitedly about their engagement, about the bookstore expansion plans, about the future that lay before them. When it was time for Maggie to return to work, Ethan walked downstairs with her, his arm around her waist. Eleanor spotted them immediately, her eyes zeroing in on the ring on Maggie's finger. "Well, well," she said with a knowing smile. "I see lunch went well." "Ethan asked me to marry him," Maggie confirmed, unable to keep the happiness from her voice. "And he has an interesting business proposition for us too." As Ethan explained his idea for expanding second chapter, Eleanor's eyes lit up with interest. A chain of independent bookstores, backed by proper funding but maintaining their individual character. "It's an intriguing concept. We'd need your expertise," Ethan said sincerely. "Your knowledge of the industry, your understanding of what makes a bookstore special. At my age, I should be thinking about retirement, not new ventures," Eleanor said, though her expression was thoughtful. "Think of it as a legacy," Maggie suggested. "A way to ensure that stores like Turning Pages continue to exist, even as the industry changes." Eleanor looked around the bookstore, at the customers browsing the shelves, at the children settled in the reading corner, at the community bulletin board filled with notices for book clubs and author events. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But first, I think we should celebrate your engagement. This calls for champagne." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of congratulations from regular customers, calls to share the news with Robert, and excited planning for both the wedding and the business venture. By closing time, Maggie felt as though she was floating on air. "Ready to see the house?" Ethan asked as they locked up the store. Maggie nodded, suddenly nervous and excited at once. This was really happening. She was engaged to Ethan Cade, about to see the house where they would build their future together. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, just 15 minutes from the bookstore. As Ethan's car pulled into the driveway, Maggie's breath caught. It wasn't the mansion she had half expected, but a charming two-story home with a wraparound porch and large windows. "It's beautiful," she said, as Ethan helped her out of the car. "Not too big, not too small, just right." "Wait until you see inside," Ethan said, his excitement obvious as he led her up the front steps. The interior was warm and inviting, with hardwood floors, a spacious kitchen, and a living room centered around a fireplace. Ethan gave her the tour, showing her the master bedroom with its adjoining bathroom, the guest rooms that could one day be nurseries, the study that could serve as a home office for their bookstore business. "And this," he said, opening the final door with a flourish, "is what sold me on the house." Maggie stepped into a room lined with empty bookshelves, a window seat looking out over the garden, comfortable chairs arranged for reading. "A library," she breathed. "For us," Ethan confirmed. "I thought we could fill it together over the years. All the books that matter to us, all the stories we want to share with each other and eventually with our children." Tears sprang to Maggie's eyes at the thought, not of the house itself, but of the life it represented. A life built on love and shared dreams, not on wealth or status. "It's perfect," she said, turning to embrace him. "All of it, the house, the bookstore plans, us. It's more than I ever dreamed of." "There's one more surprise," Ethan said, leading her back to the kitchen where a light was on in the adjoining dining room. "I hope you don't mind, but I invited someone for dinner. Sitting at the dining table, looking healthier than Maggie had seen him in months, was her father. Robert Hayes stood when they entered, his smile wide. "Dad?" Maggie exclaimed, rushing to hug him. "What are you doing here? How did you get here?" "Ethan arranged it," Robert explained, holding her tight. "Sent a car for me and everything. Said he had something important to ask me." Maggie looked questioningly at Ethan, who smiled sheepishly. "I wanted to do this right," he explained. "I asked your father's blessing before I proposed." "And I gave it," Robert confirmed, releasing Maggie to shake Ethan's hand. "After making him swear to always put your happiness first." "I will," Ethan promised solemnly, "every day for the rest of our lives." As they sat down to dinner, a meal prepared by a private chef Ethan had hired for the occasion, Maggie looked around the table and felt overwhelming gratitude. Her father, healthy and happy. Ethan, the man she loved, looking at her with adoration. This house, which already felt like home. "You know," Robert said as they enjoyed their meal, "when Maggie told me a billionaire had offered her money for a date, I thought she was making a terrible mistake. I was so afraid she'd get hurt. It wasn't my finest approach," Ethan admitted with a rueful smile, "but I was desperate to know her." "And now look at us," Maggie said, reaching for both their hands. "Dad's getting better, I have the bookstore, and we're engaged. It's like a fairy tale." "Not quite," Robert corrected gently. "In fairy tales, everything is easy. You two had to fight for this happiness, and I'm proud of both of you for not giving up when things got hard." After dinner, as they sat in the living room with coffee, Ethan brought up the bookstore expansion plan. To Maggie's surprise, her father was enthusiastic. "I could help," he offered. "When I'm fully recovered, I know numbers, accounting, I could handle the financial side of things." "Dad, are you sure?" Maggie asked, concerned. "Your health is improving every day," Robert finished for her. "And I need a purpose, sweetheart. I can't sit at home forever. We'd be lucky to have you," Ethan said sincerely. "This would truly be a family business." As they continued to talk, making plans for the future, Maggie felt a sense of completion. She had always believed in happy endings, even during the darkest times of her father's illness and their financial struggles. But she had never imagined a happy ending like this, one that included not just security, but love, partnership, and purpose. Later that night, after Robert had been driven home and Maggie and Ethan were alone in what would soon be their house, they stood on the back porch, looking up at the stars. "Are you happy?" Ethan asked, his arms around her from behind. "Completely," Maggie answered. "Honestly." "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," Ethan said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You know, when I offered you that money for dinner, all I wanted was a few hours of honesty, of real conversation." "And now?" Maggie asked, turning in his arms to face him. "Now I want a lifetime," Ethan said simply. "A lifetime of building something together. This home, our business, our family." "From bought for a night to bound for a lifetime," Maggie mused with a smile. "Not bad for a waitress and a lonely billionaire." "Not bad at all," Ethan agreed, pulling her close for a kiss that felt like a promise, like the beginning of a story even better than the ones on the shelves of their bookstore. The stars shone overhead and the future stretched before Paul. Them filled with possibilities, Maggie knew that what they had found together was rarer and more precious than any wealth or status. They had found a love based on seeing each other's true selves, on honesty and respect, on shared dreams and values. A love that had begun in the most unexpected way, with a transaction and an arrangement, but had transformed into something priceless, something that would last a lifetime. 6 months later, the garden of their home was decorated with white flowers and twinkling lights. Chairs were arranged in neat rows filled with friends, family, and employees from both the bookstore chain, now 3 locations strong, and Cade Enterprises, where Ethan still served as board chairman. Inside the house, Maggie stood in the bedroom. That was now hers and Ethan's, wearing a simple but elegant white dress. Eleanor adjusted her veil with motherly care. "You look beautiful, dear," the older woman said with tears in her eyes. Ethan won't know what hit him. A knock at the door announced Robert's arrival. He entered slowly, still moving carefully, but looking healthier than he had in years. The experimental treatment had been successful, and while he would always need to be careful with his heart, he was well enough to walk his daughter down the aisle. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, offering his arm. Maggie took a deep breath and nodded. Ready. As the music began and they made their way through the house to the garden, Maggie's mind flashed back to that first night at the Crystal, when a handsome stranger had offered her a fortune for a dinner date. Who could have imagined where that single evening would lead? Ethan waited at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on her with a look of wonder. Beside him stood his new CEO, a woman he had promoted from within the company, who had proven herself both brilliant and trustworthy. When Robert placed Maggie's hand in Ethan's, the circle felt complete. "Take care of each other," he said simply, before taking his seat in the front row. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They had written their own vows, promises of partnership, respect, and unwavering love. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause from their guests seemed to lift them both on a wave of joy and goodwill. The reception that followed was a blend of elegance and warmth, much like the couple themselves. As the evening wound down, Ethan led Maggie to a quiet corner of the garden. "Happy?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked her the night of their engagement. "Beyond words," Maggie replied, leaning into his embrace. "You know, for our first anniversary, I think I'll take you to dinner. My treat this time." Ethan laughed, the sound free and genuine. "I'll look forward to it, though I should warn you, I'm very expensive." "Worth every penny," Maggie assured him with a kiss. As they rejoined their guests, Maggie caught her father's eye across the garden. He was deep in conversation with Eleanor about the newest bookstore location, his expression animated and engaged. Nearby, Ethan's former assistant chatted with the new CEO, while the bookstore employees mingled with executives from Cade Enterprises. Two worlds that had once seemed impossibly far apart, now joined together. Just like the waitress and the billionaire who had found in each other something they hadn't known they were looking for. A love that transcended differences, overcame obstacles, and promised a future brighter than either could have imagined. Alone, a love that had begun with a transaction but had become a treasure, bought for a night but bound for a lifetime. The end.